The story of the March on Washington, where Martin Luther King Jr. gave his I Have a Dream speech, is a story crucial to the history of the United States. In August of 1963, 250,000 people gathered in front of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., to draw attention to the continuing challenges and inequalities faced by African Americans a century after emancipation. But that day would not have happened the way it did without the work of Bayard Rustin, a Black gay man and civil rights fighter. Rustin was instrumental in organizing the march, bringing together all little behind-the-scenes pieces that made it run so smoothly. But despite the support of Dr. King, it was decided that due to his sexuality, Rustin would receive little credit for his work. Throughout his life, Rustin worked to further the civil rights of African Americans, but due to his sexuality, he was recognized as only a behind-the-scenes leader, an influential aide and advisor to Dr. King and others. But he continued his work helping to organize and create great change, and in the 1980s he turned his work to the issue of gay rights, speaking at events as an activist and supporter of all human rights. While Rustin faded from the list of well-known civil rights activists because of the public discomfort with his sexual orientation, he is a true hero to both the civil rights movement and the gay liberation movement. I'm Alexis Arrington, and this is Everyone's Gay, a look into queer history. Rustin was born in Westchester, Pennsylvania, where he was raised by his grandparents. He grew up learning about the Quaker religion and beliefs from his grandmother, a member of the NAACP, while also attending services at the African Methodist Episcopal Church, where his grandfather was a member of. In his youth, Rustin became active in civil rights, campaigning against the racially discriminatory Jim Crow laws. One of the first documented realizations of his sexuality occurred when Rustin mentioned to his grandmother that he preferred spending time with males rather than females. She responded positively, telling him that if this was true, then that's what he should do. One of his later partners said that he never really sensed Rustin felt any shame or guilt about his homosexuality, which was rare for those days. From his upbringing, Rustin used the Quaker belief of pacifism and the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi, one of his heroes, to help guide him in his theory of nonviolent protests. In 1932, Rustin began attending Wilberforce University, a historically Black college in Ohio, and he was an active member of a number of campus organizations. In 1936, he was expelled from Wilberforce for organizing a strike. For a short period, he joined the Young Communist League before becoming disillusioned with the party. In 1937, Rustin moved to Harlem and began studying at the City College of New York, where he became involved in efforts to defend and free the Scottsboro Boys, 9 young Black men who were accused of raping 2 white women in Alabama. After school, Rustin began working with A. Philip Randolph, the head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and A.J. Must, leader of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, or FOR. In the late summer of 1941, Rustin was hired by FOR as a race relations secretary. They proposed a number of ways to protest racial segregation in the armed forces at the time, one of which was a march on Washington. But after speaking with Roosevelt and in a sign of good faith, they canceled the planned march after Roosevelt issued a Fair Employment Act, which banned discrimination in defense industries and federal agencies. Rustin was against the cancellation of the march, and when Randolph wanted to disband FOR, feeling like it had met its goal, Rustin disagreed and voiced his opinions publicly. Rustin was also a pioneer in the movement to desegregate interstate bus travel. In 1942, Rustin boarded a bus in Louisville to Nashville and sat in the second row. A number of drivers asked him to move to the back, but he refused. The bus was stopped by police 13 miles outside of Nashville, and Rustin was arrested, beaten, and taken to the police station, but he was not charged. And after helping to form the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, a pacifist organization who used nonviolence resistant tactics, Rustin helped organize the Journey of Reconciliation in 1947, the first of the freedom rides testing the Supreme Court ruling that banned racial discrimination in interstate travel. Corps recruited 14 men, divided equally by race, to ride in pairs through Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Kentucky. Participants in the journey of reconciliation were arrested several times, and the NAACP opposed Corps' tactics as too meek. After traveling around India, learning more about the nonviolent protest techniques, Rustin returned to the United States and lived in California. In 1953, he was arrested for sexual activity with another man in a parked car. He pled guilty to the charge of sex perversion and served 60 days in jail. This was the first time that his sexuality had become public attention, even though he had remained candid in private about his homosexuality. After working for the War Resisters League for a bit, he took a leave to advise Martin Luther King Jr. on the Gandhian tactics and helped King organize the Montgomery bus boycott. The following year, Rustin and King began organizing the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and many African American civil rights leaders were concerned that Rustin's sexual orientation would undermine support for the civil rights movement. This trend would continue in his involvement with the March on Washington in 1963. He was recruited for the march by A. Philip Randolph and became instrumental in the organization. He drilled off-duty police officers as marshals, bus captains to direct traffic, and scheduled the podium speakers. Despite the support of Martin Luther King Jr., the NAACP chairman Roy Wilkins did not want Rustin to receive any public credit for this role due to his sexuality. Wilkins stated that this march is such an importance that we must not put a person of his liabilities at the head. Because of this conflict, Randolph served as the director of the march and Rustin as his deputy, which is how he is remembered in the history books. While he was pushed to the back, he was still able to give a powerful speech at the march. Take a listen to this short excerpt.
Ladies and gentlemen, the first demand is that we have effective civil rights legislation, no compromise, no filibuster, and that it includes public accommodation, decent housing, integrated education, FAPC, and the right to vote. What do you say?
After the march, Harlem community leaders invited Rustin to coordinate a citywide boycott of public schools to protest their de facto segregation in 1964. The march called for maximum possible integration, demanding the complete integration of the city's schools. Historian Daniel Pearlston recounted that the goal was to be achieved through such modest programs as the construction of larger schools and the replacement of junior high schools with middle schools. The UFT and other white moderates endorsed the May rally, yet only 4,000 protesters showed up, and the Board of Education was no more responsive to the conciliatory May demonstration than to the earlier, more confrontational boycott. After the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Rustin began working with the workers' unions, as he believed that the African American community needed to change its political strategy and build an alliance with the white unions and other organizations in order to pursue a common economic agenda. He wrote that it was time to move past protests and into politics. Rustin's analysis of the economic problems of the Black community was widely influential. He argued that since Black people could now legally sit in the restaurant, they needed to be able to afford service financially. He believed that a coalition of progressives forced to move the Democratic Party forward was needed to change the economic structure. Here's a short excerpt from a speech on the topic.
Get a decent salary for men who are working in the name of God. How the hell are you going to get rid of poverty? All of the country people are telling me, you can't depend on the unions. They're anti-Negro. They won't stand with you. Well, I think the record here shows that in Memphis, this fight is going to be won because the Black people of this community and the trade unions stand together, man to man.
But after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Rustin was forced to switch his focus, as he agreed to fly to Memphis to help lead the campaign in King's absence. Rustin faced opposition by the movement leadership regarding his involvement due once again to his sexuality, and this eventually caused him to withdraw his agreement. In the 1980s, Rustin was urged by his partner Walter Neal to get involved in gay rights activism. Neal later reflected that I think that if I had not been in the office at the time when these invitations from gay organizations came in, he probably wouldn't have done them. But soon Rustin became painfully aware of the lack of social progress in the area of gay rights, and was moved by the persecution and wished to see homosexuals recognized as first-class citizens.
He did not work with the gay rights movement simply because he was a member of the community, but rather because he saw the community as part of the human family, and truly believed that everyone deserved equal rights and opportunities.
In many speeches and writings, Rustin stated that he saw the events of Stonewall as part of the protest tradition, in line with the women's rights, civil rights, and anti-war demonstrations. He argued that it was the beginning of an extraordinary revolution, similar to the Montgomery bus boycott, and that it was not expected that anything extraordinary would occur. They began to fight for the right to live in dignity, the right essentially to be oneself in every respect, and the right to protect under the law. In other words, people began to fight for their human rights. Gay people must continue to protest. Due to the lack of marriage equality at the time, Rustin and Neagle took an not really unusual step to solidify their partnership and protect their union for the time. In 1982, Rustin adopted Neagle, who was 30 years old at the time. It was the only thing that they could do to legalize their relationship, and they were together until Rustin's death on August 24, 1987. In 2012, Rustin was inducted into the Legacy Walk, an outdoor public display which celebrated LGBTQ history and people. And in 2013, he was selected as an honoree in the United States Department of Labor Hall of Honor. On August 8, 2013, President Obama awarded Rustin the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest award in the United States. In the speech, Obama said this.
Now, early in the morning, the day of the March on Washington, the National Mall was far from full, and some in the press were beginning to wonder if the event would be a failure. But the march's chief organizer, Bayard Rustin, didn't panic. As the story goes, he looked down at a piece of paper, looked back up, and reassured reporters that everything was right on schedule. The only thing those reporters didn't know was that the paper he was holding was blank. He didn't know how it was going to work out, but Bayard had an unshakable optimism, nerves of steel, and most importantly, a faith that if the cause is just and people are organized, nothing can stand in our way. For decades, this great leader, often at Dr. King's side, was denied his rightful place in history because he was openly gay. No medal can change that, but today we honor Bayard Rustin's memory by taking our place in his march towards true equality, no matter who we are or who we love.
For more information on Bayard Rustin, his life and his work, I recommend a 2003 documentary titled Brother Outsider: The Life of Bayard Rustin, which documents his life as a fighter for civil and human rights. Today, Bayard Rustin is recognized as an unyielding activist for the civil rights, dignity, and equality for all. And while there's still much more that needs to be done,
as an openly gay African American, Bayard Rustin stood at the intersection of several of the fights for equal rights
and pushed every movement he was a part of forward. I'm Alexis Arrington, and this has been Everyone's Gay, a look into queer history. We'll see you next time.
One last thing. The Black community in America has been and is under attack from abusive government policies and police brutality. The queer community and the history of the gay rights movement never would have happened without its Black, queer, and trans members. So please, if you are able to, consider donating to one of these organizations. Black Lives Matter.